Hello, welcome to the Hoops&Huddle podcast. I am Malika Walker, and this is our weekly trip to the rewind, looking at the past of men's and women's sports. Today, we're going to look into basketball, men's basketball to be specific, and we're going to cover a lot of hoop topics, on this pod. But today, I had to officially launch the rebrand of my pod with the greatest what if of all time, Len Bias. And I had to bring Mark because Mark, him being a trainer to some of your favorite NBA players and knowing the history of the game, Len Bias is just one of those players that we will both always wonder, what if
Yeah.
he made it to the NBA? What if he was able to join the Boston Celtics and help extend the careers of some of the greatest like Larry Bird and McHale and some of those others. What if, he was able to him and Reggie Lewis, I think it was, right? Were able to play against, Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen. What would that have what would the results have been? Because people like to say, oh, Len was this, Len was that. But we will never know because the 6'8" wonder never played a game in the NBA. So I'm welcoming Mark to the pod, and I'm excited to talk about Len Bias with him. So introduce yourself, Mark.
Mark Edwards, been training players for 30 years. I think my first guy went pro back in 2001. I like to stay behind the scenes. I really like to have the players have their shine, so I don't put like videos out and stuff like that. But I've had NBA All Stars, I've had NBA champions, I've had college champions, high school state champions. For me, it's a labor of love. And watching people like Len Bias, I still would love to develop a player, in his resemblance, but it's so difficult because he was so disciplined. Yeah, the way he played the game, he simplified the game. He had a talent. He had the skill set. He had the determination. The work ethic was crazy, and you saw him improve over his 4-year career at Maryland.
Yep. And
So,
Len Bias, I mean, of course, he hails from Prince George's County in Maryland. He was one of four children. Growing up, he had one sister, three boys. He was the middle boy. So he had a younger brother. He had an older brother. In University of Maryland, they were blessed to get this talent. They knew that they had someone that was raw, that had a lot of talent. So when we think about, Len Bias as a freshman, like he really got his name when you look at him in terms of he didn't start his freshman year. That didn't start to his sophomore year. But you saw flourishes like of who he will become at Maryland his freshman year.
yeah, you saw bits and pieces of him his freshman year. You saw some potential, especially when they played against North Carolina. I think he got up for those games against Michael Jordan. They didn't necessarily check each other, but on switches and on occasions when they went at each other, it was amazing because Mike was going to his junior year. That was 83, 84. That was Len's sophomore year, and I mean, you could just see it. You could see him coming, and I think the transition from his freshman to his sophomore year was the strength training. The word I got was he started lifting weights for the football team,
Yeah.
and he was a slender build, but you could see. I mean, he started cutting up. His body just kept getting stronger and stronger every year. He started just jumping, and
Yes. Yep.
he would dunk on you with reckless abandon, like he'd taking off outside the lane with two hands and daring you to jump. And he was menacing on the court, and he played the game the right way. One dribble, two dribble, pull up,
Yep. Yep.
jumpers. They didn't have threes in the ACC back then. They actually had it his freshman year. and he might have shot about 20-some%, 25% or whatever. But he definitely extended his range to, legit, possibly NBA range. Even though he didn't necessarily take a bunch of long twos or whatever, you could see the range on his jump shot. There was no stopping him. Them playing zone meant nothing to him. He was an immovable force.
Yeah, and I'm just realizing I started off without the microphone. So my
Oh yeah,
my cats started making noise. I was like, let me get on the mic and put my headphones on here. And when like, I think another thing that people like, now you see players working out together in the summer. You see, that players played against each other in AAU. MJ and Len Bias met. You know what I mean? Like, like like when you look at some of those back then, like now you have the camps. They had like the 19 and other camps back then, right? So they actually had an opportunity to meet and play one another in those type of settings. And I always wish that we can have like ample video and of the greats of that time in these camps, not just
that would
them,
have been
but
crazy.
oh
That would have
my
been crazy.
God, I would have loved to.
They didn't put an emphasis on that back in the days.
Yep.
The camcorders back then were huge. It was like
Mm-hmm.
this
Mm-hmm.
big, and it was on your
Mm-hmm.
shoulder, and very few
Mm-hmm.
people could afford those things. But the footage, the pieces of footage you get to see of Michael Jordan when he was young is just incredible.
He was so
I
scrawny too. Like when you look at him,
Yeah,
especially compared to Len Bias, MJ was small.
yeah, he was like, I think going into the NBA, he was like 6'6", 185,
Yep.
190. I think so. I think his rookie year, he might have been 195, 190, 195.
And
But
Len Bias was like 6'8" and 200, 210.
yeah,
By
he's
the time
about
he was
210.
senior.
Yeah, he's
Yep.
about
Yep.
210.
Yep.
Solid.
Mm-hmm.
Both guys, very low body fat. Both of them probably had 2 to 3% body fat. And
Mm-hmm.
that meant something. That meant they're utilizing so much more muscle than most athletes. So with Mike, the crazy thing about Michael Jordan is when people look at those college and early NBA highlights, they like, well, those guys he playing against must not have been that good because he's just running by them and they look slow. No, Michael Jordan had world class speed.
Yep.
And that's the thing people can't understand. They can't understand and they don't
They
believe.
forget the athleticism and all of that of Michael Jordan at the time. Like
Mm-hmm.
young Mike was, yeah, Mike was a different cat.
It so and it's crazy because I've been watching him since he was a freshman in college.
Mm-hmm.
And I would always get word from North Carolina about him. I was a big basketball guy when I was younger. So the word I got was that as a freshman, he ran a 4.5 40 and 4.5, 4.6, maybe 4.5s, and he long jumped 25 feet. That's crazy. That's crazy athletic
That's
ability.
crazy. Yes. And the reason
Yeah.
why we're setting this up, because it's important, I just think it's important to understand, like, Mike was Mike. We know young Mike was athletic. He was jumping like a pogo stick, jumping all over the
Mm-hmm.
place. And young Mike was, who young Mike was, like from 84, to 86, 87. Len Bias, MJ was between 6'5" and 6'6". Because sometimes I wonder if he was 6'6", to be honest. He was between 6'5" and 6'6". He wasn't, when he got in the league, he wasn't quite 200 yet. Over time, he like he gained, muscle, I guess. But Len Bias was a 6'8", 210. He was, like he was a lot bigger than MJ. They played different positions. But when he was like, let's talk about Len Bias from the time he starting at Maryland in his sophomore year. And then as time went on, like, as we look at, him each year, like his sophomore year, he was at 15 points a game, 5 rebounds. His junior year, he was at 19 points a game, 7 rebounds, and then 23 points a game his senior year and 7 rebounds. So as you look at that progression of the games he played, from the time he started, that was it. Like that was it.
Yeah,
So
his shooting
talk about his,
ability.
yeah, yeah,
His shooting ability is something that you want to marvel at. You
yep,
talking about his field goal percentage. He shot probably
like
53, 50 something
50.53.
percent.
Yep, point
Yeah,
53. Yep,
I mean, just
that's crazy.
his
Yeah,
free throw percentage his senior year was something that still amazed me. He shot like 86% on like seven
yep, like
attempts.
86. Yep,
Yeah.
86%.
Um,
That got better
that
each year too.
yes,
Yeah.
that
Yep.
requires so much discipline. His
Mm-hmm.
form never
Mm-hmm.
changed. His leaping ability. I mean, just he was a force. I can remember watching him catch an alley oop and dunk on a player and one.
Mm-hmm.
And he comes
Mm-hmm.
down and his arms are like straight up in the air like this.
Mm-hmm.
And he hits the
Mm-hmm.
player in the head, and the player's like getting ready to step to him. And the referee jumps in the middle and he puts his hand on the referee's chest and said, "Chill, I got
Mm-hmm.
this."
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
he was like, he just started talking to the player like, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, yeah." Whatever he was saying, I don't know. But I'm looking at him like he's in command. Like it
Man,
was his world. Like it was nothing you could do to stop him.
nothing they can
Nothing.
do. Yep.
Nothing.
I
Nothing.
feel like Red Auerbach had his eye on him early because he invited him to a camp, I believe, between his junior and senior year.
Mm.
And um so he had his eyes on Len Bias, before he even had the opportunity to draft him.
Who was the
Like
first pick in that draft? 86.
the 86 draft, that's a good question. Who was the first pick in the 86 draft?
Mm.
Let me look up the 1986. Um, I don't know why these emojis. Hold on.
Brad Daugherty.
Yep, yep,
Brad
yep.
Daugherty. And back then, you couldn't walk away from a skilled 7 footer. 7 footer, the game was played inside out back in the
Yeah,
80s.
back then
So,
you had to take
yeah,
size. Yep,
you had to
yep,
take him. And that was the Cleveland Cavaliers. He was the missing piece for that Cavaliers team that
yep,
eventually was
yep.
a multiple
And he
50
was,
win,
yes,
60 win
yep.
team. Yeah, they were the best team in the NBA at a juncture with
Even when they
Mark
look at the other
Price.
drafts, like the 84 draft,
Mm-hmm.
and 85 draft, like
Yeah,
you had to take that you had to take that 7 footer.
yeah,
That was the pick. Like there
yeah,
was, and like whenever you speak to GMs at that time, it's like, oh, there was, and even the GMs of the teams that ended up like they're like, no, there's no way we would have picked him. And the pick made another pick. So yeah, Brad Daugherty made perfect sense in a point.
yeah, yeah. And he was young.
Mm-hmm.
He
Mm-hmm.
was young coming out of college, coming out of high school. I mean, I think he got to hhigh school. He was like 16
Yeah, because
when he got
he
to
came
North
out a
Carolina.
senior. He came out a senior.
Yeah,
So yeah, he probably was high school. He came out early because he was a senior when he came out. Len, of course, went second to Boston Celtics. He was excited to go there. I mean, who wouldn't be? I mean,
yeah,
they just won the championship, that year. That the 86, I think, was the Celtics. Like of the 80s Boston Celtics, and probably one of the top teams all time, period. Like I had to do a episode on teams and their top runs all time, and for Celtics it was the 86 of that era of the Celtics. And then to
yeah.
have Len Bias coming in, I mean, Larry Bird was so excited. He was like, you know what, you get Len Bias, I'll come to the rookie camp.
I remember that. I remember that. I
that
remember that. That was crazy. That was crazy.
that pretty much says it all right there.
What's even crazier is when you think about that draft, that 86 draft. If I remember correctly, like Brad Daugherty, who did 4 years at Carolina, was only 20 years old when he got drafted. He
Wow.
didn't turn 21 until like later in the year, and he did 4 years at Carolina. So when you think
Yep.
about his skill set, you think about his agility, how much he got better every year. He's a footer. You know what I'm saying? Like you had to take him because Len was the most dominant player in college basketball. It wasn't even close. But the way they drafted back then was just so different.
It
So for Larry
was.
Bird to be excited about, coming back and coming to rookie camp, which is something no one does. Veterans never came to rookie camp and summer league and all that. That
Yeah,
wasn't a thing.
that pretty much told you how excited, like he was to even get a talent of this level. When you look at that draft, like you had, well, of course, we already talked about Brad Daugherty was in that draft. Ron Harper,
Mm-hmm.
who was a champion with the Bulls and the Lakers. You know, you
Mm-hmm.
had John Sally in that draft, Del
Chuck
Curry
Person was
in
in
that
that
draft,
draft.
Chuck Person was in that draft. Um,
Sabonis,
yep,
Mark
Sabonis,
Price,
Del,
Dennis Rodman.
yep, Dennis Rodman. They had some hitters in that
Mm-hmm.
one.
Drazen
Um,
Petrovic,
and
who
yeah,
is so
he
underrated. He's
and then
so. Mm,
that's something that's going to have to be I have to talk about Drazen Petrovic. I'm about to
yes.
start reading his biography that I think his brother wrote, and I he's one of my favorite Nets, but that's a whole other
People
topic.
are people are starting to bring him back up. What's my man name? The play for the Houston Rockets. He's talking about him right now.
I know who you're talking about. He's been making the rounds on the pods. He
Maxwell, Vernon
Yeah,
Maxwell.
Vernon
Vernon
Maxwell. Yeah,
Maxwell.
he said he was
He's
harder
so
to guard than MJ. Yep,
yeah, because he
yep.
ran off screens, and
Mm-hmm.
if he
Mm-hmm.
caught the ball, you knew he was going to take the jump shot. And if you ran out at him, he just hold the shot fake,
Yep.
and you watch you go by, and then knock down a shot. And he played off his pivot. He was amazing. He
He was
was amazing.
amazing.
He
He
was
was
amazing.
amazing. One thing about I always think about when it comes to Len Bias, say if he entered the league, was he signed a 5-year, $1.6 million deal with Reebok.
Mm-hmm.
So you would have had this whole Reebok, having Len Bias versus Nike, like
Mm-hmm.
with MJ and how we are today about
And that was a
football.
lot of money.
Yeah,
1.6 was a lot
1.6
of
was a
money.
lot of money back
Yeah,
then.
yeah, that
five
was a lot
year,
of money.
$1.6 million deal. That was because they also saw the impact that MJ had on Nike.
Mm-hmm.
So, because that deal, Mike's deal, 84, and then you have Reebok in 86, they were like, you know what? We're going to invest up front. We're going to, you know what I mean? Signing him to that deal, they saw what the potential impact of that could be.
Yeah.
But being drafted, he was on a, right, and then, going home to party after that deal was signed, like it was like, okay, his
Mm-hmm.
life was set to begin in the league. And then he parties at night, like in the dorm back at the University of Maryland. Like one of his friends, Brian Tripley, made comments that, like him and Lynn, they were casual users of cocaine. It wasn't that's what they were addicted to. It was just a party drug at the time. So, it was something they did here and there. His parents didn't believe that Len Bias, like was a casual user to them. They just didn't believe it, contrary to what Brian Tripley was saying. I just wanted to note that his family has definitely different views on that. But the thing that gets me about the night that Len Bias died was the pureness of the cocaine that was used.
Mm-hmm.
How in the heck did Ryan Tripley get cocaine
Well,
that
I mean, I don't know if he's specific. I don't know. I can't say who, but you got to remember at the time, one of the biggest drug dealers in the country, Rayful Edmonds was they had that cocaine all over, Maryland.
mm,
He
mm,
actually just came home, so having that pure of a drug around, I don't think it wasn't that difficult. That was a crack cocaine era, so they was getting great pure cocaine and diluting it with baking
they were
soda
diluting it.
and
Yep, that's a
ice
good point
and
too. But I don't,
all kind of stuff.
if this was on the street though,
Yeah, yeah,
like
yeah, yeah. It's on the street. I mean, that's what it was. You were getting a pure cocaine back then, and you would turn it into crack. And the purer the cocaine, the more crack you can make, because you can dumb it down or whatever. That was
that's
what was going
true.
on.
I do remember. I remember that. It's just
Yeah,
that with because like Len Bias had a seizure, never regained consciousness, and he would die of a
because you don't know how much cocaine can you snort. You don't know.
yeah, you
Because
don't
I
know.
can remember them saying he had snorted a ridiculous amount of cocaine. Like, what are you doing? Like, you literally, a lot of people were getting introduced to cocaine as a party drug at parties, at Hollywood parties, at
Right.
industry parties, at Studio 54 and stuff like that. So, it was in small amounts. People were, It
Because I
was
heard it
easy.
was a. I heard it. What we can say is that cocaine. They did You know, he did cocaine that night. The amount, because I heard it was a small amount. You heard it was a lot. He did cocaine that night, and it was, and he went into a seizure and never regained consciousness.
So remember what they were talking about? They were saying that Lenny had an enlarged heart.
Yes,
And it's
which
crazy because they say the
yeah,
same thing about Reggie Lewis. But what people didn't understand at the time is when you're an athlete, you know, your heart is a muscle. So the
yes,
more athletic you are, the bigger your heart gets.
yep,
You know what I'm saying? So I don't know what the effects were with the purity of the cocaine and how much he snorted or whatever.
yeah. That's
But
getting to technicalities.
yeah,
Yeah, that's. But it's just like it was such a
I
shock.
cried. I
It
cried.
was a
I
shock. I
cried.
remember. Yep,
I
I
cried.
remember
I was in high school. I cried.
I remember the adults around me were
Mm-hmm.
devastated at that time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and I remember that it
That
was
was going into my
great.
senior year. That was my junior year, going into my senior year. That was '86, and I I couldn't believe
Yeah, I
it.
was
It
in
didn't
high
make
school.
sense.
I didn't
It didn't
like,
make
the
sense.
basketball team. I remember the basketball team being devastated. Um, I couldn't, I couldn't believe it. You know what I mean? It was a
It
shock.
didn't make sense. That it's
It
not something
didn't,
that
like, it was like,
it
huh?
wasn't something that we saw on a regular basis. This wasn't normal. Like if something like that
Yeah.
happens now, it's like, oh damn, yeah, that's messed up. But back then it was like, wait, what?
What? Like it was, I
What?
remember it being, it was
We
like
just
almost
got
like, where
drafted.
were you when you found out? Like for me,
I don't even
when
know
I
where I
found,
was.
I don't remember where I was, but I remember finding out and it being a shock. And then when we did go back to school, um, it was like, it was like a moment of silence. It was like,
It wasn't
like
for us.
the athletes were all like shook. I remember
It's
that.
it's crazy because I went to Canarsie High School in Brooklyn,
Mm-hmm. I went to
and
East High School in East Orange, New Jersey. And it was, yeah, it
it
was
wasn't
something.
it wasn't it wasn't it wasn't like for me. So I was a basketball fan, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So like I followed Michael Jordan.
Yep.
Nobody. I
Same.
introduced my
Yep.
best friends into following. Like, look, there's this guy, and I think he's an alien. Like he moves differently. He
Yep.
walked differently. He had a
Yep.
different bop. I remember watching. They played because I remember when UNC they played in Carmichael Arena. They didn't have the Dean Dome yet, so we
Yep.
played in Carmichael Arena. And the way North Carolina tradition is that you cannot walk on or off the floor at North Carolina. And
Mm-hmm.
I watched Mike come out, and he'd run to the corner and like dip and like drop his shoulder
Mm-hmm.
like a. And
Mm-hmm.
I was like, wait, what is he doing? He was just weird, you
Yeah,
know.
84. I will never
It,
forget when in 84 when MJ came in the league. And
I went to the
I
game
was
at
an
the Garden.
MJ fan as well, but with only reason I knew about Len Bias because my stepfather watched a lot of basketball. And and so Len Bias' name was, that's he was on the scene. They talked about it in the barbershops and like him, him versus MJ, like, the young guns leading these because it was like the big thing was like, well, Celtics fans were like, well, we still got Larry and the guys, ushering in the young boy, and they gonna train the young boy and like those conversations and
It would have been so
the
easy for him.
transition of the guard. MJ don't got nobody like that. Like he the man
No,
there,
yeah, they would have
and
won
yep,
two more championships easily. Larry Bird might have been able to play a little bit more because
yep,
a lot of
yep,
the stress would have been taken off of him.
yep,
You talk about, I remember Worthy going to the Lakers, but then he broke his leg early, you know, with the Lakers situation. So he was still retain his quickness, but he never got his full athletic ability back as
yep,
an NBA
yep.
player. Because
Mm-hmm.
if people watch highlights of Worthy in college, he really was getting up there. And it's crazy because he would talk about how Jordan was jumping just as high or higher than him, but Len Bias was jumping higher than all of them. So my thing is, I watched Mike's progression, how he got stronger, and as he got stronger, he jumped higher, he ran faster. Because when he left Carolina, they told me he was running a 4.2, 4.3 40. And I was like, wait, what? Are you
Mm-hmm.
serious?
Mm-hmm.
So when I look at
Mm-hmm.
Bias, I think of, he started lifting weights early. So that was his advantage. Then he would have got to the NBA and would have been lifting even more weights. He got stronger. He'd have been in a system that would have
Mm-hmm.
catered to him. He would have scored easier. I think he would have challenged Michael Jordan
He would
for
have.
supremacy
He
in
would
the
have.
East. It would have been a problem. I only think Jordan had was he had a huge head
It
start
also would have
in
been
regards to
interesting him
sneakers.
versus the Pistons as well, because remember, like, like the Bad Boy Pistons era was
Well,
also coming at that time.
think about it. When you think about it, that '86 draft was John Sally and
Yep,
Dennis Rodman.
and
But
Dennis Rodman.
those two guys would have nothing they would have been able to do to him. Nothing.
Yep, yep. No,
Nothing.
I just mean
Nothing.
like it would have been interesting in the East because we know what happened in the East.
Yeah.
Like if you had those Celtics in the East, you know what I
That
mean. That would have been something. We just were never gifted
yes.
with, and it. I always, said
That
college. I was like, what?
Isaiah
We
Thomas's legacy would have been in trouble.
the alternate reality of
Mm-hmm.
like what if Len
Isaiah
Bias
Thomas's legacy would have been in trouble. Larry Bird's legacy would have been boosted up even more.
and
Those
MJ
Celtics
and
teams would have been.
I think it would have been interesting what moves would the Bulls have made to counter
But
like
you
try to
don't.
get some veterans or something like
But
what
you. But
could they
you.
have done?
But you got to remember, back then, guys were on long contracts, so
That's
there
true.
wasn't a lot
Yep. It
of
wasn't
free
like today.
agency
It
stuff.
wasn't
Yeah,
like today. Yeah.
free agency wasn't a thing back then. It was like, no, I'm with my team, I'm staying with my team. I have a 10-year contract, so on and so forth.
Yeah. Free agency
Nobody's
came.
renegotiating. They're
I
not
forgot when the
renegotiating
first free agency
contracts.
contract was. I just did some research on that for an episode I'm doing in the future. But
Well,
yeah, it was a different world back then.
they had free agency, but guys were locked into
It
contracts.
wasn't like
Yeah,
widely celebrated yet. It
yeah,
wasn't that it wasn't
and
that much of a thing.
yeah, and then the shorter contracts because guys were doing upwards of 10-year contracts. I mean, you got to
Yeah.
think about Magic Johnson had a 25-year contract.
Hence the
There's no way.
Scottie Pippen contract.
Yeah, he did the
That was
10-year. Yeah,
yeah.
that was ridiculous. Even though they told him not to, and I mean, sometimes you just gotta grin and bear. You gotta listen. You gotta. I mean, but he still was making money off the court, which kind of still bothers me because Nike was still paying him a nice little something. So I just, when Scotty talks about I had to sign the contract, no, you didn't.
Yeah, that's a
Yeah,
whole man,
yeah. I'm not.
that's
That's
a
a
whole
whole. Yeah,
other that's a
and I
whole
love
other rabbit
Scotty.
hole. But
I
also
love Scotty.
The Knicks got Patrick Ewing in '85. So I just think the Knicks I just think the East would have looked completely different. But we know that in '80 we know that Bill Walton was injured. He couldn't come back. Like in '87. So that like we knew that some
He's
injuries was
he's with
happening
Bill
at that
Walton.
time.
He was Bill Walton times two because the thing about it is he spent 4 years in college,
No, all I'm
and
saying
at
is
that
the
uh,
Celtics, they wouldn't have had Bill Walton. Because you
yeah,
remember, and Kevin McHale, his foot wasn't the same after those playoffs with the Lakers when he like broke his foot. Like he never got that repaired, and he wasn't the same after that. So they would, but I think that Len Bias would have still like having someone like him in that lineup, that would have been a really excellent transition of the guard for the Celtics. And they could have competed in the East. They could have competed, for, an Eastern title and, and competed with because I don't, like you said, I don't think the Bad Boys would have been able to do, like any, with Len Bias in that lineup. That could have really given them some problems. Like we would never know. You know what I mean? Like the East would have looked different if Len Bias had lived. Unfortunately, he did not. And one of the effects of that is something that impacted um, Black, Latino, and minority communities for decades to come. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986,
mm-hmm.
also called the Len Bias Law. And I think the reason why it was a shock. Maryland is right next door to Washington, D.C. Also, we got to remember, that, like Len Bias died June 19th, 1986.
Mm-hmm.
So school, when you think about it, we didn't really deal with that in school until the fall. You know what I mean? When it happened, and you know what I mean? It was really at the end of the year. Then we got to remember there was another death. Don Rogers at the Cleveland Rogers died of cocaine on June 27th. Like he was a 1985 Defensive Rookie of the Year. And it was such a shock to, and Congress felt like they had to act. They felt like they had to um, assemble because it was all on it was the news. It was on the news. Like every night that it let off on the news. And you had congressmen feeling like they had to respond. And, then you bring on the mandatory minimums of crack cocaine, like mandated a 5-year sentence for 5 grams. You had congressmen now saying they didn't realize how small a quantity that was and what type of impact that ended up having on Black and brown communities. Because as we know, crack cocaine impacted, the crack cocaine versus powder cocaine sentence guidelines were completely different at that time. And at first, it was like a 100-to-1 ratio, when you look at it. Like 5 grams for 5 years, like while, with, for powder cocaine, their numbers were a heck of a lot higher than that. So you didn't have the same impacts on first, you have white versus white people versus and black people, because in the black communities you had a lot of crack cocaine. Let's keep in mind that Len Bias and Roger Brown both died of an overdose of powder cocaine. But with the anti-abuse law of 1980, the anti-drug law of 1986, they came down hard on crack cocaine because of the crack houses and the they publicized crack houses. So they had that crack house law too. So it was like you had so many, really tons and tons of Black men, Black women being locked up for years, some of them getting these crazy sentences. And years later,
For being users, which
for
is crazy
being
to me.
users. Yeah,
Not
it was
not even saying
crazy.
they were distributors; they were users. And
Life
what
ruined.
doesn't make sense is the opioid epidemic that
Yep.
our country went through. Instead of locking them up, they opened up,
The response was
clinics.
completely different. Yep.
Yes,
Yep.
it's
Yep.
like
They locked us up and threw
you
away.
know,
They locked up Black and brown people and
poor
threw
white
away the key.
people, they're
But with opioid,
suffering.
that's not what they did. They wanted
Yeah,
to get treatment centers and not
yeah,
treat and wanted to get them help.
yeah.
With crack cocaine, it was throw them in jail for forever and throw away the key. You
Yeah.
know, it was crazy. The impact on mass incarceration. I mean, it's just insane.
But I
And
think that was totally, I think, a government setup type of thing. I mean, it's crazy because I remember the campaign "Crack is Whack" came out in
yeah.
1986 as well. The dude painted a mural in Harlem or whatever, and then that became like a national thing or whatever. They started, having all the crack cocaine commercials or whatever. It was a war on crack, but it really was a war on Black people. Because let's be clear. I have a really strong knowledge about the drug. I had family
Mm-hmm.
members who abused it. I had family members
Yep.
who were part of the problem or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Crack cocaine wasn't something that was created in the United States. Crack cocaine was created in Colombia.
Mm-hmm.
So because cocaine in Colombia was so inexpensive, like $1,000 for a kilo, and they still couldn't afford it. So in Colombia, they created crack cocaine. How did that drug get over to the U.S. and how did we learn how to make it? Oliver North testified, in front of Congress or whatever, that the United States, the CIA and so forth, they brought
Yep.
cocaine and flooded
Into
the
the community.
ghettos with
Yep.
cocaine.
Yep.
And so if they flood the ghettos with cocaine, knowing that in the ghettos you could not afford it the same way you couldn't afford it in Colombia, they 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 basically taught certain people how to make the drug, make crack,
Yep.
and they
Yep.
knew that now the poor people can afford it, and they flooded the nation with it. That was
Mm-hmm.
something that was, that was a government thing. So just things like that. When you talk about slavery, when you talk about drug abuse, crack cocaine, when you talk about all these things, redlining, all the things that this country has done to Black America, Black and brown people, and the conversation about reparations never comes up. It's never taken seriously right now. Is the most painful thing ever to me, because every other ethnicity and race that's gone through something as horrific as that has gotten
Mm-hmm.
some type of reform, some type of
Yep.
reparation
Yep.
to their community, and they refuse to do that to us. So yeah, I believe Len Bias was used. They used him
Yep.
to further their backroom conversations about how to destroy Black people. In my opinion, that's just my opinion.
And they definitely used him to, and I hate that his name is linked with this law.
Yeah,
Like Len Bias law is what they call it, and I hate that. Young man that had so much promise that was
yeah.
going to, like bless the basketball courts with his skill and, give us a world that we'll never know.
It doesn't make sense that
What
somebody
if
with
Len
good.
Bias lived and now he's attached to this law that caused, really a generation was lost when you think about like, that were locked up and, just had irreparable impact
It doesn't make
upon
sense to me.
generations of people.
It
Like,
doesn't make sense.
it's just insane. And I hate that his name is linked to this. I hate it.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, like, so when I want to celebrate Lim, I feel like you can't talk about Lim Bias without talking about the impact of this law it had on people for generations. Apologies will never get back what people lost. And then, they died of, and I'll say it again, both of these men, Len Bias, and because, there were two people that died, Len Bias and Don Rogers, they died from powder cocaine over, like usage that led to their eventual deaths. Not crack, but the crack cocaine portion of it was heavily taxed with the jail, meaning like the jail disparity there, the jail sentence and the punishment versus powder cocaine was completely different. And then they attached Len Bias's name to the law when he wasn't even. So it's just insane. And like we just said, it's a pathetic and pitiful that Len Bias's name is attached to the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986. It's referred to as the Len Bias law, which is unjust. But as basketball fans, as lovers of the history of the game, we can't help but wonder what could have been if Len Bias was still with us and was able to, um, all we can do is imagine, you know what I mean? Like LeBron came later, but sometimes when I think of Len Bias and the potential, you know what I mean? Like, who knows how we would have been talking about him? You know what I mean? Has size at that age, coming in as a rookie. Man, we'll never know. But yeah, for me, it is the greatest what if. What if the Boston Celtics got Len Bias?
Yeah.
What if Len Bias, like what would have happened in the East with Len Bias being drafted to the Celtics, able to take on a lot of that work that some of those older guys couldn't, and there was a good transition of the Celtics from the big three of the Celtics, McHale, Bird, Parrish, and those guys, transition with Len Bias coming, Reggie Lewis eventually coming, and what could have happened? We will never know. Like would Detroit would have would they still have won 2 championships? Like what would have happened with the Bulls? Because as we said, free agency isn't the free agency of the day. So what would have happened versus the Bulls? It would have been great marketing, Michael Jordan versus Len Bias. That marketing, like the commissioner would have had a field day with
Yeah, he would have. He definitely would have. And it's crazy because they wouldn't have guarded each other, but there would have been instances where they did,
Yep.
Go up against each other. It's crazy because Scottie Pippen would have had to check
Scottie
Len
Pippen.
Bias, and
Yep.
that would have been
Yep.
painful for him. And it's
Yep.
crazy. I remember when Len came in that 86, that was his 86, 87 season. Mike had an amazing year, but Kevin McHale, he had his best scoring year that year in '86.
Yep.
I think he put up like 26 a game. So and he was like first team all defense. I mean,
Yep.
and then that started him on a roll of like all stars and all defensive teams and stuff
Yep.
like that. So you talk about the next 5 years, you'd have had Kevin McHale and Len Bias as 2 front court pieces.
Yeah.
And you literally could have put Larry Bird as the 2. When you think about it,
Larry Bird, even though his back was already messed, I think he would have got more longevity. He wouldn't have had to play as many minutes.
Yeah, because Bird his back didn't just go out totally until like 91. That 91-92 year, that was like his last year.
That was his last year, yeah.
Yeah. So
from what I read, he was already having back problems, and
he was doing too much. He was running on that hard Celtics floor, and they would talk about his work ethic and how hard he worked. And in the summer times, he was shooting outside on his outdoor basketball court, on that concrete. So he was killing his back. And then
what I read is his back was hurting for a while. But 91, that when it got to that 91s, his back was done. He couldn't do it anymore at that point.
Yeah, he was done. He was done.
But he would have been able to transfer his knowledge. You know what I mean? But
I think he wouldn't have to play as much, because when you think about the amount of minutes guys played in the 80s, guys were playing 39, 40 minutes. That was on a regular. Nowadays, if you play 35 minutes, people are like, oh my God, you're trying to kill these guys. It's crazy because the Knicks team, they played all those playoff minutes. Oh, they're playing 40-some minutes. They're tired. And I'm just like, wait, what? That's what they used to play in the 90s and the 80s all day long, especially in the playoffs.
They never wanted to come off the court. You know what I mean? Are you kidding? And when you think about it, Red Auerbach is already goated. When you think about him being the first, Celtics being the first team to field an all-black starting 5, in the late 50s, early 60s. And it's fun, him and Auerbach then being connected to the Celtics of the 80s, and then ushering in the Len Bias era. He's already seen as one of the greatest minds.
He was an innovator. He was an innovator because he was like, you know what? I'm going to get these black players. He was an innovator where everybody was like,
he just wanted to win. He didn't care. He wanted to win.
That's right. He wanted to win.
And, I was thinking, he would have been, he was there for the Bill Russell era. He was the GM during the Larry Bird era. And then he would have been ushering in the Len Bias era. He was on to something. And
he was on to something. It's like, black players.
But in the middle of that, you have Larry Bird, Kevin McHale. You have that era as well.
Mm-hmm.
But we will never know. And one day we're going to do a look back on the Celtics, because
we need to celebrate Len the same way we celebrate Cheryl Miller, in my opinion. Although she won those 2 championships or whatever, I think that was her first 2 years. But I'm in regards to what he could have been.
Yep.
And they don't.
Because Cheryl Miller on the women's side,
because of the drugs. Like Cheryl
was the injury.
Yeah. Since he got hurt, she never got a chance to play pro ball. She got hurt. Len died. It's definitely 2 different things. But in regards to what we knew they would have been at those next levels, is only our imagination. We can only imagine.
I'm going to have to do an episode on Cheryl Miller, because I don't think people will fully understand. She just had she was just on Mark Jackson's podcast, and she was talking about the game of today.
She
And
still
she,
talk. She still talk
I
junk.
love her.
She's
She's
still
trying to get
talking
back into
junk. I love her.
broadcasting now, I think. But I think the interesting part she said at the end, she said, Asia, because she marvels at how great Asia is today, like as a player. And she was like, that girl, that young
Asia is
lady
reminiscent
can,
of Cheryl.
yeah, that
Asia
young
is
lady can
reminiscent of Cheryl.
play. And she said, I'm going to say something controversial. I think I could have hung with her. I think I could have defended. I think I would have been a good matchup for her.
Yeah.
And you know what? We'll never know. You know what I mean? Like, but I was like, I just think the game has evolved so much, and that's a whole other conversation. We're talking about and
Don't get me
don't
going
get me
on this
started.
because
Don't
you
get me
know
started.
we'll be here all night.
No,
Don't
we'll be
play
here all night.
all night.
But let me just say to close out Len Bias, we will never know what would have happened with you. All we can say is what could have happened, what would have happened if you would have entered the NBA. You're the greatest what if of one time of all time in basketball. We'll never know, and
My dream
that's
is to
why
build somebody like him.
every year, his name comes up all the time
Yeah.
because fans feel robbed that we did not get to see you in the league. We never got to experience you in the league.
Yeah.
But even more heartbreaking is the family of Len Bias. The parents of Len Bias ended up losing his younger
Yeah.
brother a few years
Yep.
later, and my heart goes out to the Bias family. Because Jay Bias lost his life a few years later.
Yeah.
And his was gun violence, like he was shot. But my heart goes out to the Bias family. But here at Hoops and Huddle, we're going to celebrate those the greats of the game from years past. We're going to celebrate some of the ones of today too. But we're going to really dive into the history of sports because I'm not just going to limit it to hoop. It's good, some football. Like there's some things coming up in black quarterbacks. We will discuss it here.
We
Um,
need to discuss that because this generation, this is what Generation Z,
mhm,
they they don't really study the history of the game, and I
yeah,
think that's crazy. I mean, I can remember watching a video of Gary Payton talking to a high school, camper or whatever,
yeah,
and he gave him some amazing advice. And then one of the coaches walked over and was like, "Do you even know who that is?" And the kid was like, "No." I'm just like, "Are you serious?" Can you imagine in baseball guys not knowing who Barry Bonds is? Can you imagine in
yeah.
football a running back not knowing who Barry Sanders is? You know what I'm
But
saying?
and
Like, it
then
wouldn't
also in the
happen.
women's game, we have a whole generation that don't know who the greats of the game of years past are.
I
And
have a
I
list.
feel like it's my responsibility to present the history of the game, and share it with those who basically want to hear it. You can
Yeah.
sit at your desk while you're working and hit play. Next week we'll have another episode, Hoops and Huddle, talking about another great of the game from years past. But thank you for listening. Len Bias, forever love. Bless. Thank you for being here, and we're out.